very much. It's a pleasure. So folks are aware, I do have both a photographer and a videographer with me today to document this presentation. It's actually first time that I've been able to get a documentation of me doing a presentation that's not to kindergartners. So thank you very much for all of you coming in, and we will definitely get to the question and answer point. And really, this works best as a conversation. So as I'm going through the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and jump in and cut me off. Otherwise, I could keep you guys in here all day. How do we advance this slide?
I can go.
Okay. Do you mind?
I can hear it.
Okay. So let's go ahead. So disabilities in the hospitality industry. And really what we're talking about is accessible diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which are big buzzwords. And you guys will, some of you have probably heard those already. Those are the big buzzwords in corporate culture these days. What gets left out is that accessible piece. And so if we could move to the next slide, maybe. There we go. So what is accessible diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging? So disabilities as a part of diversity. Frequently people will say, Jeremy, why do you think accessible needs to go in front of that? Because disabilities are part of diversity, right? And they absolutely are, but what's different there is that in order for your organization to reach those diversity goals, people first have to be able to get in the door. And so people with disabilities, more often than not, are overlooked, yet we represent a global culture that crosses all other demographics. People with disabilities are actually the largest growing minority in the world. We are growing exponentially as a result of trauma and conditions of aging, which are totally natural. But the point being that in order to achieve that diversity, you have to add that A first. You've got to be able to be accessible. So we're going to talk about welcoming and practical appliance of the ADA, because it is entirely possible to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and yet do it in a way that is not welcoming to people with disabilities. And then the value of belonging, because that both on the guest level and on the employee level, belonging is what gives you a sense of, well, it's a sense of belonging. It's what makes you feel like you belong in that operation. It reduces turnover. It increases your guests as they feel comfortable in that operation. And recognizing that people with disabilities are not traveling alone. They're not individuals by themselves who are the only person experiencing the issues that they run into. Those obstacles are also experienced by their loved ones, their family members, their friends, their caregivers, whoever's wanting to travel with them. So let's move on to the next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and sit down, if that's all right, rather than standing here the whole time. Although, actually, before I sit, let me give you guys a moment while they work on that to see how my legs work, which these are rather amazing, and we'll talk about why I have these in a minute. But my legs are called power knees. These are the phase 3 next generation technology. They actually have robotics and an artificial intelligence that senses when I want to move. When I go to stand up, they lift. When I go to walk, I just have to move my hips. The knees do their job. When I go to sit down, they recognize that I want to do that, and they give me a little bit of resistance so that I don't fall. And I'm going to go ahead and sit just for comfort reasons. And then we'll talk about disabilities. So there are a lot of different disabilities. The diversity of disabilities could be an entire class all by itself. You have acquired disabilities like mine. When I was a student here at Purdue, I did not have these legs or anything remotely similar to them. I had my natural legs and walked all over this campus. And I've been very impressed today moving through the Union and Stewart Center at how accessible it is and how well it's marked. In addition to acquired disabilities, you have disabilities that folks are born with. They come into this world with a disability. A lot of the time you will see conflict when people who have acquired a disability and people who are born with a disability talk about their different perspectives because they are very, very different. Somebody who's grown up with a disability has actually had more time to adjust to those challenges, whereas somebody who acquires it later in life has a real hard time making that change from what they were used to, what they were able to do previously, and understanding how to adapt and reach the same goals that they once were able to do before the disability. You have visible disabilities like mine, and I wear them so that everybody can see. I wear a kilt or shorts pretty much year round. If we were talking about the uniform policy in a hotel, I would be asking for an accommodation because it is easier for me to access my legs if I need to with shorts or a kilt than having to wear pants, in which case I have to take everything off to get to the knees if I need to make any kind of adjustment. So then you have hidden disabilities, all sorts of hidden disabilities. ADHD is one of the most prevalent ones that affects people all throughout our culture. You have physical or medical disabilities, which mine technically falls under that category as well. Then you have sensory disabilities, people who are blind, people who are deaf. You have intellectual and developmental disabilities. I already mentioned ADHD. There's cerebral palsy. There's Down syndrome. There's all sorts of things that impact the way a person perceives the world, the way they interact with other people. And so within the hospitality industry, understanding that, and I'm not suggesting that people at the front desk need to be able to diagnose every guest coming in. That's not okay. That's not something that we should do. But understanding how disabilities impact that interaction with our guests can change the way that the front desk clerk or the manager on duty or the server in the restaurant or the bartender is interacting with their guests. And when there are conflicts, it can help improve the outcome of that situation if you have an understanding of how disabilities affect people. So we have some statistics here. The global population is about 16%. The United States is about 13%, and Indiana is 14%. These statistics are really very low. In reality, we think that the number is really more of a quarter of the population worldwide, and it's really about the same in Indiana and the United States. The reason that these numbers are low is because a lot of people are afraid to identify as a person with a disability because of obstacles like pride, fear, concern of discrimination. And so understanding that within diversity and within all the other cultures that represent the concept of diversity, disability crosses all of that. So my point there, and the other thing is to understand that the population of people with disabilities is exponentially growing as a result of trauma and the natural conditions of aging, which I mentioned at the beginning. So when we think about our guests, when we think about our employees, recognizing and being accessible both in the front and the back of the house increases an operation's ability for success. So if we move into the next slide. So my hospitality experience, just to give you guys a clue, I, again, am an alum of the HGM program here, dating myself. It was the Restaurant, Hotel, Institutional and Tourism Management program at the time. I'm so glad we got it down to HTM. But I started out with Weingartner and Hammonds. When I was a student on campus, I was an intern of theirs. I spent probably about 5 years with that company in an AGM role in multiple different cities and markets. I was with White Lodging, was on the opening team of the Marriott downtown. And this, of course, is all before I lost my legs. After White Lodging, I went to Sodexo Conferencing, and this is where things get interesting. Look at this hotel, and this is the main entrance. Does that look very accessible? Nope. Um, so 6 months into my career with Sodexo Conferencing, which was an interesting thing, we were taking what was a mom and pop hotel on DePaul University's campus and renovating it and turning it into a conference center where we still also had to be available to the student organizations, the student body. And so it created, yep, we also had to turn a profit. So that created all sorts of challenges. And during this renovation, this hotel was built before 1990. So 1990 is important because that is when the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. And because this hotel was built before that, no renovations had been done to it until we were there. It was not accessible. So we had to figure out where are we going to put an accessible hotel room. We only needed one per 50. We had 50 rooms. We needed one that would be accessible. There was an accessible parking lot right behind the building where you could actually come right into the lobby without having to deal with stairs. But those doors were not accessible. They didn't have the button. They weren't functional. And I actually had an interaction with a member of the board of trustees for the university who was putting forth the money. The board of trustees was putting forth the money for this renovation. And he approached me in the lobby in a wheelchair, pointed at those doors and said, "Jeremy, are we going to make these doors accessible as part of this renovation?" And I said, "You know what? Nobody's even mentioned that. Let me go ask the general manager." And so I went and I checked with him. And if you see, there's this other building there, you see the glass windows. That's actually a hallway that connects the hotel to a newer building at the other end of that. Kind of looks like a church, but it's really a conference center. And that building was built after the ADA. It had all of the accessible entrances, was connected to our hotel through a hallway. And so I was told, no, we weren't going to make those doors accessible because the other building had all the entrances we needed. That wasn't really the way that the ADA, the spirit of the ADA is meant to work. But so about a week after that conversation, if we could move to the next slide. And this is where memory gets weird. This is what happened. I was commuting home from work. I was still living in Indianapolis, driving an hour to and from work every day. And a 16-year-old turned left in front of me on a county road. So what should have been an hour commute from the hotel back to my house wound up taking about 8 weeks before I returned to my house. I was hit on the passenger side, forced into a utility pole, which there where the Jeep has that big V, that is where I hit the utility pole. The driver of the other vehicle hit me on the passenger side. The Jeep crumpled around me like a tin can, came to rest on its passenger side, as you see it here, except this actually happened out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields and horse farms. And so this picture was taken the day after. I was pinned in the driver's seat, and then about 5 to 10 minutes later, a fire erupted. I can't tell this story without telling how I was rescued. So there was no opportunity of me getting out. I remember trying to get the soft top off of my Jeep with this arm. And if you can see, there's a scar here. It's my favorite scar. But my wrist was so badly broken that there was no way that I could do that. And with it laying in this position, the soft top wasn't going to come off because the ground was pinning it. And I couldn't get it from the inside. Within a matter of minutes, and I know it sounds like a joke, a minister who planned to stay at home and watch a movie, but only all of a sudden had a craving for food he could only get in a restaurant the next town over, went to have dinner there. He comes upon the scene of the accident. The next person is a retired nurse who was sitting at home watching TV and decided that she needed to go for a drive. She gets out of the car, and this happens around 8:30 at night in October. Disability Employment Awareness Month, by the way. And so when this occurred, she gets out of her vehicle. It's nighttime. She almost walks into the power lines that came down when I went off the road and hit the utility pole. And a man walks out of the cornfield with a flashlight, stops her, guides her around the power lines to my Jeep, where the three of them begin fighting the fire. And I remember the nurse asking who I was, telling me that I was going to be okay and that they weren't going to leave until they got me out. And me responding that I smelled smoke, that I saw flames, and then that I was on fire and begging for them to get me out. My memory goes blank. However, the story is that I was wide awake and directing the rescue effort as they were trying to pull the soft top off of the Jeep and get me out. Probably because I have a degree from Purdue University in managing people. So I sustained 4th-degree burns to my lower legs that required amputations. Also, my jaw was broken, my forehead, eye sockets, cheekbones, and nose were broken. The doctors said that the x-ray of my head or my skull looked like the broken windshield kind of spider web pattern. Luckily, all of that healed. My jaw was wired shut when I woke up. I had a trach and a feeding tube going into my stomach. I was asleep for about 6 weeks. And then the process of getting back to work and modifying my life began. And one of the first questions that I asked when I woke up was, when can I return to work? And the response that I got was, what do we need to do for you to return to work? And Sodexo did some amazing things. They held my job for 1.5 years while I was in physical therapy learning how to walk. And then when I returned to work, initially it was just a few hours a day, even though it was an hour commute to get there. But learning how to walk on my legs in the hotel, a hotel that, again, was not really very accessible. It only had 1 floor that was accessible by elevator. My office was in the basement, so we had to figure those things out. And one of the things, understanding your benefits is really, really important, and utilizing them. My long-term disability benefit included vocational rehabilitation counselors who would have come to the hotel and helped not only me, but my coworkers figure out how to modify my job so that I could continue to be as effective as I had been before the loss of my legs. And in my role as director of operations there, I was stripping beds, I was getting trash out of the guest rooms, I was bartending, I was serving, I was setting up banquets, doing all of those things. It was very, very, very physical. We didn't understand that that was part of the long-term disability benefit, so we did not utilize that. And it made the transition that much more challenging. A year after my full return to work was when the recession hit in 2008, 2009. And one of our leadership positions had to be eliminated. There were 3 positions: the general manager, the director of sales, and the director of operations. And we had to decide which one of those, obviously it wasn't going to be the general manager, needed to go away. And so the decision was that the director of operations position would get eliminated. That was me, that was my job. Sodexo walked into a very dangerous minefield in that they really did open the door for an EEOC suit against them for terminating the job of an employee with a disability. When, if you looked at our leadership team, the rest of the leadership team was weak on the operations side. They were very strong on the sales side. They could have eliminated a sales position and kept the operations position. One of the things that they did to avoid that EEOC suit was in the way they handled my termination, the elimination of my job. Not only did they give me extra severance and help me with COBRA and all of the aspects of that, but they also
went ahead and paid for a consulting firm to work with me on how to update my resume, how to update my bio, and how to really redefine my identity and my direction. And in that process, I made the decision that instead of trying to work in the hospitality industry, where my first day back to work, somebody complained about waiting 5 minutes to check into their hotel room, and I wanted to take one of my prosthetics off and slap them with it. I then understood I no longer had the empathy to actually deal with customer complaints. I needed to go a different direction. So public speaking is where I went. That eventually goes into what leads to me being here today. Honey, if we could move to the next slide. So we get to disabilities in the work environment. And again, like I said, I did not understand any of this. Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act is what defines how you make certain that you're not discriminating against people with disabilities in the employment process. And so it applies to everything from interviewing to how you give out the day's instructions and assignments, all the way through termination. Make all aspects of the employment experience. And so the more that you understand that, the better that experience can be for a person with a disability and for the hotel or the operation, hotel, restaurant, movie theater, hospitals, museums, all different aspects of society that touch the public sector. So understanding that there's, when you talk about accessibility, we're not just talking about ramps. We're also talking about the programmatic accessibility. So if you were developing a program like this, if somebody is blind, they can hear the presentation, but they can't see the actual images. So being able to describe that there is an image of a person with a wheelchair checking in at a front desk, and that how that applies to concepts of universal design and accommodations, which is where if you actually design things from the beginning to be accessible to everyone, you save a lot of money on the back end of not having to spend money making accommodations and modifications for folks that really you should have included in your concept when you began it. And one of the things, does anybody notice it's a good example of universal design, but what's missing here? The person on the other side of the desk. This desk is not designed for somebody working in a wheelchair to check somebody in and out. So, and that's one of the things that I actually had to do when I first returned to work, was design a new front desk that would allow me as director of operations to get behind the desk and check people in and out if I needed to. Accessible DEIB training and assessments. This is where you focus on the programmatic aspect of it, making certain that you are able to include people with all different types of disabilities in all the types of training that you do. Now, one of the questions while we're talking about this, we talk about reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations are required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. But what that means is the accommodation reasonable? I was having a conversation with a chef friend of mine who also graduated from Purdue, Cliff Hull, if anybody in the room remembers the name. And he and I are very close, and he was saying, Jeremy, I can't employ a person in a wheelchair in my kitchen. And I said, well, okay, if your kitchen was not designed for that, and you have to look at what it would take to modify the kitchen, what you then look at is how much money is the operation making? How much is it going to cost to make that modification? And does it put an undue hardship on the operation to make that modification? Modifying a kitchen to employ a chef in a wheelchair is, if it wasn't designed to do that in the first place, that probably is going to create an undue hardship. But understanding that a person with autism who needs to maybe wear headphones that are noise canceling so that they can focus on their work could be a very effective chef, might mean modifying your policy about no headphones in the kitchen. Why do you have that policy there? It's there for safety reasons. Okay, can we find a way where a person with autism can wear noise canceling headphones? Do we understand what those are? Because they're not broadcasting music to the individual. They're not distracting them from what they're doing. They're actually making it easier for them to be in that environment and focus on their goals. So understanding how to communicate with that person gives them the opportunity to work in that environment, as long as we're willing to modify policies, procedures, as much as we are the physical environment. Utilizing community resources is a huge aspect that I did not really see much in my time in the operations. And those community resources we'll talk about later, but Centers for Independent Living are huge. They're there to help people with disabilities set their independence goals. And a lot of time that is work. And being able to rely on those types of resources within your community can help you employ people with disabilities. Going beyond the ADA, again, the ADA sets a great guideline, but going beyond that to ensure that you're really applying these things practically, that creates innovation. Having a person with a disability on your team changes the question from a person with a disability can't do this to how can we achieve the same goals by modifying the way that the job is done. And that creates, that motivates the concepts of innovation that you need that lead to greater productivity. And really at the end of the day, that goes to the bottom line. I'm getting ahead of myself. And then again, that sense of belonging, that's going to reduce the turnover because somebody is happy in the environment and they also understand how much has gone into that work. And I don't want to give off the concept that a person with a disability who is employed is like a golden retriever and is going to be loyal because of that. That's not the case. But after going through all the effort to modify a job and to request those accommodations, once those things are all in place and somebody is productive and effective, they are happier in their work setting than a lot of folks tend to be. And so again, you have reduced turnover. We can go on to the next slide. So the guest side of things. I have this handheld shower head pictured here because this is the first hotel that I have stayed in. This hotel was in Milwaukee. And it was the very first hotel that I have stayed in the last 17 years, 18 years this month, that I have checked into a hotel where I did not have to call down to the front desk and ask them to send the bellman up to bring that handheld shower head down from the highest point to where I could reach it. And yet the accessible hotel room is meant for a person with a disability. So service interactions, we talked about Title I of the ADA, that covers employment and how you don't discriminate against a person based on their disability in the employment setting. Title III of the ADA is what opens up the public sector. And people with disabilities will tell you that Title III of the ADA is what has made the biggest difference in their lives. Why do you think that would be? Title III of the ADA is what says that I should be able to get into the movie theater along with my wife and my kids. It's what says that there needs to be a certain, well, the architectural guidelines of the ADA are what says exactly how much space there needs to be in a restaurant between the tables and the chairs for somebody in a wheelchair to get through. Or having menus that are in Braille for somebody who is blind to be able to read. And that right there is a misnomer. We all assume that people who are blind know how to read Braille. Not everybody who is blind does. So being able to be comfortable asking that question in a restaurant, sir, do you need a Braille menu or would you like for me to read through the menu options for you? Making certain that your staff is comfortable with something like that is huge. The arrival, occupancy, and departure experience is all tied up in that. I will tell you, parking is the number one complaint of people with disabilities everywhere, whether you're talking about self-parking, valet parking, special event parking, and making certain that your staff is trained. We recently went to an event that was specifically for a blind organization called Dining in the Dark that was held at the JW Marriott downtown in Indianapolis. And they did an amazing job. The point was for us to experience what it is like to be blind for a brief moment, and just as we were eating dinner. But as we pulled up to the hotel, I asked the staff, and if you've ever been to the JW Marriott, the convention space is huge. And once you get down into the parking garage, depending on where your event is, if you're a person with a disability, you want to park as close to the elevator that's going to get you to your event as possible, not the elevator that's going to get you to the check-in desk. And so as a result, I pull up to the valet. I ask the valet attendant where I need to park, because I drive a vehicle with hand controls, and I'm not really comfortable with a valet attendant, even if they've been trained on how to drive a vehicle with hand controls. I'm not really comfortable turning over the keys to my car to somebody who maybe does that once in 2 or 3 months. So I asked, where do I need to go? They did not know where in the hotel the event was being held, so they could not tell me where I specifically needed to park once I got down into the parking garage. That goes to the training aspect, making certain that people are aware of these things. So we get into the accessible hotel rooms. I already mentioned the shower head. Reservations. You should be able to make a reservation. The 2010 updates to the ADA now require that people with disabilities be able to make reservations for hotels, sporting events, concerts, everything else online the way that everyone else can do. You run into these challenges, these questions, and I remember having these conversations before I lost my legs about, well, how do we guarantee that a person with a disability is the one reserving the room? You don't. How do you guarantee that the person with a disability checking in is aware, or that the person checking in is a person with a disability who needs that hotel room? You don't. But when you're looking at filling the hotel, and a perfect fill, 100%, means that you have a head in every single bed. Hotels oversell, typically, depends on the market, but up to 20% at times. And so when you're in that sold out night and you have put a head in every bed, but the person who reserved the accessible hotel room that you filled an hour ago comes in a wheelchair at 1 a.m., what are you going to do? Have you already prepared for that and gotten a hold of other hotels just in case they come in to make certain that you have an accessible hotel room specifically ready for that person that you're going to send them to? And do you have wheelchair accessible transport to get them from your hotel to the next one? So understanding that when you're looking at a perfect fill, my recommendation after losing my legs to every hotel has been that you don't count those accessible rooms in your perfect fill. You make certain that you hold those rooms for the person coming in the door, whether or not they show up. And that's a different way of approaching the business. Knowing the features of accessible hotel rooms, when I call to make a reservation, I have this conversation all the time, and people at the front desk, people in reservations, especially at the 800 number, may have some basic information, but I guarantee you I'm going to ask a question that they are not going to know the answer to. Does your hotel have wheelchair or have accessible lifts to get me out of the pool and the hot tub? Per the 2010 updates, your answer should be yes, because that's required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. But does your maintenance team know how to work those? Do you have the battery available for them? More often than not, when I get to the pool, as we've experienced many, many times, the battery is missing. Nobody knows where it is, or it's rusted because something was not right on the seal and it's not functional. And because somebody's not checking these things on a regular basis, my wife and I now have a challenge being able to utilize the pool or the hot tub. or we're sent to a hot tub while the pool area is being resurfaced, and it's a hot tub that goes between both the indoor and outdoor parts of the facility. And because the indoor part wasn't covered, it's now got all sorts of debris in it from the resurfacing that was going on inside. You experience these things because folks don't necessarily think to check them. From guest amenities, we never thought about this. Distilled water for CPAP machines. After losing my legs, I had a more sedentary lifestyle than what I had before. I was no longer climbing all the steps to inspect all the floors. And I developed severe sleep apnea. So now I have to travel with a CPAP machine that forces air in through my nose to keep the soft tissue in my lungs or in my throat open so that doesn't close while I'm sleeping. People can actually suffocate to death from severe sleep apnea. Having a gallon or two of distilled water behind the front desk for a guest that forgot to bring distilled water, or they arrived after the pharmacies in your area closed, so they can't get the distilled water and you don't have it for their machine. Having those couple gallons could actually prevent a housekeeper finding a body. And yet we don't carry distilled water in our gift shops. We don't carry it behind our front desks. Weighted blankets for guests with developmental disabilities. Somebody with autism who is having an emotional event, a family member could potentially call down and say, hey, do you have a weighted blanket? A weighted blanket could completely alleviate a situation that will improve somebody's guest experience. Sensory rooms, not necessarily something that I would expect any hotel to have, but if you have trained your staff to understand what a sensory room is for, and if those exist, and you're having a guest experience where somebody is throwing a fit at the front desk, being able to say, would you like to step into our sensory room where we can have this conversation in private and you can have some space to relax, might provide somebody an opportunity to calm down and to get to a point where you don't have to spend as much on guest or service recovery. Safe shower chairs, benches, ADA kits for the blind. Hotels that are on beaches, I have never seen one that has a beach wheelchair. And yet what an amazing experience that would be for me to be able to call down and say, hey, do you have a beach wheelchair so that I can access the beach with my family? And if you don't, do you know what vendor in the area does? Simply knowing these things can improve a guest experience tremendously. Travel companions, I already mentioned, they're traveling with us. They experience our challenges and obstacles sometimes more so than we do, because it frustrates them to watch us have to struggle with these things. Service animals, anybody else in the room surprised that miniature horses are among the two? Nope. Okay. I would love to see somebody bring a miniature horse in. I've never seen it, but yeah. But yes, service animals, but per the ADA, are dogs or miniature horses that have been trained to assist with specific tasks. That doesn't mean a person's blind. It might be a dog that is there to remind somebody to take their heart medication. Or they are aware when somebody is starting to have some kind of emotional or mental break, and the service animal is able to provide them whatever comfort they need to pull out of that. So you don't actually get to say, we don't allow pets in our building. You can say, we allow service animals in our building, because you can't deny a service animal. What do you do then when you have a guest who has an allergy? You need to be prepared to do a very detailed cleaning of that room after that dog has been there, or miniature horse. So we can move on to the next. All right. ADA compliance, like I mentioned, uninformed, unwelcoming approaches. Typically, this happens because an operation does not have a person with a disability who is actually advising them from the beginning of the design phase of the operation all the way through the actual execution of the customer service. an inaccessible layout. This is a beautiful hotel, beautiful accessible guest room, lots of space for me to move around in my wheelchair. No major issues from that aspect until I realized that it was really cold and we needed to change the temperature in the room. And I go to the thermostat, but this really fancy Art Deco light that looks like a tripod, similar to this, has been put in front of the thermostat. It's actually between the nightstand and that part of the wall that juts out. The thermostat itself, this picture's a little bit distorted. It's actually higher than it should be, where I would be able to reach the controls if I could get to it. I can't see the actual screen to be able to determine what temperature I'm setting it at without being able to stand up. And you see my prosthetic legs there off to the side. I, as a bilateral above knee amputee, have this luxury, actually, of having the option to get out of this chair. There are a lot of people with disabilities who don't have that option at all. And so then you very well may wind up, your housekeeper gets up to this room after this person is checked out and they're calling maintenance because the thermostat has been knocked off the wall because the person tried to get to the buttons with a stick and in the process broke your thermostat. These kinds of things can happen. This next one, this is an inaccessible design. This is a restaurant that has a drive-through, and when they took over this restaurant, and it used to be a Boston Market, they renovated the restaurant, turned it into I'm not going to say what kind of property it is now, but they turned it into something totally different. They did a beautiful job renovating the property, restriped the lot, did all sorts of things. Per the ADA, and they only needed 2 accessible parking spots. That's how 1 per 25 is the code. So, but the ADA says that they need to be the parking spots that are closest to the entrance. Now, when this restaurant took over this property, this is the way that the accessible parking was for the Boston Market. They rearranged their drive-through, put the drive-through order kiosk on that side of the building instead of at the back of the building where it used to be. And so by doing that, that changed the traffic flow of the parking lot to where anytime this restaurant, which their business is primarily drive-through business, anytime they are at moderate to peak business volume, a person with a disability cannot access the accessible parking spots in their parking lot. They have 6 designated parking spots outside of the drive-through line for 10-minute mobile orders for people who can jump out of their car and run inside. What message does that send to a person with a disability, whether they are coming there to dine in or they're in that drive-through line? That message is, we don't want your business. Even if that's not what they intend to say, it's what their layout is telling a person with a disability. Dangerous design, again, completely ADA compliant in regards to the architectural guidelines. However, for a person with no legs, sitting on a shower bench that is that small, I have to have perfect posture while I'm showering. And from a amenity standpoint, soap, shampoo, all that kind of stuff, the shelf that's designed for it is actually way over here out of reach. And so it creates a very dangerous, slippery situation where I have to reach down while showering and holding onto that bench to not injure myself. Again, if a person with a disability had consulted on the design, this would not have happened. Can we go to the next slide? We are almost done, and I realize we may be at the last few minutes for Q&A. But so the operational benefits: enhanced customer service through training, through guest amenities, through hiring people with disabilities, and making certain that your facility is accessible to include guests with disabilities and their loved ones. Improved financial performance. And the one thing, because I was not thinking when I did this, the one real big benefit that I mentioned earlier is that innovation. That motivation for innovation and the way you do things can improve productivity, which goes to the bottom line. You increase your market share because people with disabilities are going to say, that hotel, that restaurant, that that movie theater is the best place for a person with a disability to go. So now you're getting that person with a disability and you're getting all of their family and their friends. Minimized risk of discrimination claims, minimized risk of injury. And these are huge. Discrimination claims and injury claims can cost an operation hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the more you are focused on these things, the better your bottom line is going to be. Lastly, questions. Oh, resources. Sorry. So yes, I've already said you need to have a person with a disability doing these things. My organization, Walking Spirit, is providing accessible diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consulting and support services. That is actually designed to be a month-long process, depending on the size of the operation, where I'm looking at front and back of the house, consulting with the team, developing a customized training program for that operation. And then I'm on hand for support after that. I also provide inspirational speaking services. And if you know anybody with a disability who's struggling to adapt, I am always happy to have the conversation about how you begin adapting your life and try to get them towards the local resources, your Centers for Independent Living, state vocational rehabilitation services, regional ADA centers, other local disability focused nonprofits. And again, I believe I mentioned earlier, your own benefits, making certain that if they have those vocational rehabilitation services available, that you utilize them. So our last slide is questions. Actually, the second to last slide is questions. The last slide is my contact info. So any questions? Sorry, I know I gave you guys a lot. And you can ask anything. Nobody has asked me a question yet that I have said, that is too personal, I'm not interested in answering. Anything? Yes. I'll let you guys argue over who goes first.
I stepped out for a bit because I wanted to kind of hop into some of the other.
That's fine.
So I'm Michael. Have you seen over time, I guess, more of an awareness of the, so I'm part of HTM, but I came in as a travel journalist, and there's a few travel journalists who focus on disability and welfare. Have you seen more of an awareness of this over time? As there's more media focus, less media focus?
I haven't seen as much awareness put on employment of people with disabilities as I think needs to be placed on it, especially within the hospitality industry. And granted, we're going back almost 20 years now. It'll be 18 years this Sunday when my accident happened. But at that point in time, one of the biggest mistakes that we made was we would utilize organizations like, say, Putnam County Comprehensive Services to bring in people with disabilities to work in housekeeping and in culinary, typically giving them public space jobs or dish tank, that type of work, laundry. And where we missed the boat with that was the training that our staff needed to receive in regards to how to professionally and properly communicate with those employees. And more often than not, the supervisory teams would look to the job coach from whatever organization they were from to handle all of those issues instead of dealing directly with the employee. So a lot of the times I saw that mistake. I have seen improvement in regards to accessibility within hotels. Like I said, they finally got to check into a hotel where they had the handheld shower head where I could use it without having to call for somebody to adjust that. But it's in the training. So like that particular hotel, we checked in, had a wonderful arrival experience. They were giving out champagne. I'm in a wheelchair with a duffel bag in my lap. My wife has 3 bags in her hands and they give us champagne. And now I'm trying to maneuver a wheelchair with a duffel bag, one hand, and a champagne that I'm spilling all over your lobby as I'm going to the elevator. That's where we missed the boat. So, you had a question?
Yeah, effective training.
Effective training.
What would you call? Because a lot of people, it's not that they don't understand.
Right. So the effective training, I believe, what makes it most effective is coming from a person with a disability. because that is what drives that personal connection home. And so then somebody starts to think about that, they start to understand it. It needs to be a ongoing thing. You can't just train your staff once and say, okay, we're done. It's something that needs a refresher. And again, it needs to be from someone with a disability. It doesn't have to be a visible disability, but it needs to be somebody who's willing to say, I have a disability, this is how it affects my life, and this is how the way you apply these services and goods and employment aspects benefits my experience or makes it negative, depending on the way the approach is done. Yes.
Is there a website like that shows like hotels like around a specific area that are like the best for people with disabilities?
So I have seen a couple different websites try to do that effectively. I have yet to see, so I've seen Yelp even have on Yelp a way that you can review those kinds of things. There is a similar, I can't remember the name of it, but there is a website that somebody in Canada who travels with a wheelchair and continually encountered issues. Airlines, by the way, are terrible, and I'm always afraid my wheelchair is going to be broken. And that happens more often than not with other people. Thank goodness I've not had that issue. But they created their own website for that very reason, where people with disabilities could go on and say, I stayed at this hotel and it was great. The problem is getting people with disabilities to be aware of it and to use it, and making certain that our operations are accessible for them to travel to them and actually provide that review. So I haven't seen any of it done effectively yet, but I believe we're getting there. So, yeah. Yes.
So based on your experience as a customer, what was the most comfortable hotel brand to stay with?
The most comfortable hotel brand to stay with. Typically, Marriott gets really close to getting it right. And I know that with Marriott's, if I run into an issue and I call down, I'm at least going to get somebody who wants to try to make it right. And from that standpoint, their customer service training is wonderful when it comes to making certain that they are empathizing with their guests and trying to find a solution. So, but really, I mean, Marriott's, Hyatt's, those, they get close. They still don't quite get it right, but they have the amenities. They don't have the distilled water, but they have the other stuff that they need. So yeah. Other questions? Anybody else? Can we do the last line? All right. So if there are no other questions, here's my contact info. My website is walkingspirit.org. It's eclectic. Sometimes it's about disability, or it's very much about disability. Sometimes it's about hospitality environments. Other times it's something totally different. But I mean, even this is a national park. This is Arches National Park. And as rugged as it is, it was accessible enough for me to enjoy it. And that is the other thing, is understanding if you're in any areas like this, where your guests might be going to places like this, knowing what resources are there for them. You don't have to have the beach wheelchair or the off-road wheelchair, but it's best for your concierge staff and your front desk staff to know where they can actually access that equipment. So thank you all for your time.